What if one of the biggest mistakes you can make when buying a used SUV is assuming that the cars everyone wanted when they were new are still the cars worth buying today? Because here's the strange thing about the UK used car market. A car can be expensive, fashionable, and highly desirable when it rolls out of a showroom, and then a few years later become almost invisible to buyers. And when that happens, depreciation can become your best friend. We're talking about SUVs that once carried price tags well into 5 figures, yet today you can find examples for less than £6,000. Now, before you get too excited, there's an important distinction here. We're not saying every £5,000 SUV is a bargain. Far from it. Some are cheap because they're old, tired, and heading towards an expensive repair bill. But others have simply fallen out of fashion, been hit by depreciation, or lost their appeal to new car buyers, and that can create some genuinely interesting opportunities for somebody shopping on a budget. And that's exactly what we're looking at today. 5 UK market SUVs that have suffered surprisingly heavy depreciation, with some examples now sitting around or even below the £6,000 mark. And the interesting part, some of these cars still offer the things people originally paid a premium for: a higher driving position, decent equipment, plenty of room, and that feeling of driving something a little more substantial than an ordinary hatchback. Well, we're going to look beyond the badge, because at this price point, the question isn't simply how cheap is it? The question is, how much car am I actually getting for my money? And more importantly, how much is this thing going to cost me after I bought it? Because there's a massive difference between buying a cheap SUV and buying an SUV that's genuinely cheap to own. So let's start with number 5. And this first one is particularly interesting because on paper, it looks like exactly the sort of car that shouldn't have fallen this far. Number 5, Vauxhall Mach-X. The Vauxhall Mach-X is one of those cars you probably remember seeing everywhere. It arrived during the explosion in popularity of the small SUV, giving buyers the raised driving position they wanted without the size or price of a much larger 4-wheel drive vehicle. And when the Mach-X was new, it certainly wasn't positioned as a bargain basement car. Vauxhall's own pricing puts some versions at well over £20,000. Current used listings, however, show examples of the Mach-X being advertised for under £5,000, including a 2018 1.4 Turbo Elite at around £4,595. One current listing even shows an original MRRP of £23,195 against a £4,595 asking price. That's a dramatic fall in value, roughly 80% in that particular comparison, and that's actually more dramatic than the 70% figure in our title. But there's a cat. You don't get a nearly new £23,000 SUV for £4,500 without making some compromises. The first thing you need to understand about the Mach-X is what it actually is. This isn't a big family SUV in the traditional sense. It's a relatively compact crossover, which means it's easier to maneuver around town, easier to park, and generally less intimidating than something physically much larger, and that can be a real advantage. The driving position is one of the reasons people liked these cars in the first place. You're sitting higher than you would in a normal hatchback. You've got a fairly commanding view over the road, and getting in and out doesn't involve dropping yourself down into a low seat. For someone who values easy access and good visibility, those things matter far more than whether the badge on the bonnet is fashionable. Inside, the Mach-X also has plenty of the equipment buyers wanted when these cars were new. Depending on the trim, you could get things such as navigation, cruise control, parking sensors, and upgraded interior equipment. And this is where the depreciation starts to make the car interesting. Imagine walking into a showroom years ago and being asked to spend more than £20,000 on a well-equipped example. Now imagine finding something similar for less than £5,000. Suddenly, the badge doesn't seem quite so important. But here's where I'd be careful. A £4,500 Mach-X isn't automatically a £4,500 bargain. At this age and price, condition becomes everything. The difference between a carefully maintained example and one that's been neglected can be enormous. And that's why I would pay particular attention to the service history rather than getting distracted by a shiny set of alloy wheels or a touchscreen. Look at the MOT history. Look for repeated advisories. Check the tires. Listen carefully to the suspension over broken roads. Make sure every electrical feature works. Test the air conditioning. Check the clutch if it's a manual. And if you're looking at a diesel, don't ignore the possibility of expensive emission system repairs simply because the purchase price looks attractive. The petrol versions can make more sense for somebody who mainly does short journeys, but again, don't buy an engine simply because somebody on the internet says it's the good one. The individual car matters. How has it been serviced? How many owners has it had? What's the mileage? Has it spent most of its life doing short urban journeys? And perhaps most importantly, is there evidence that the previous owner actually looked after it? Because this is the trap with heavily depreciated cars. People see the original price and the current price and assume they've discovered some kind of secret bargain. But depreciation doesn't tell you whether a particular example is good. It only tells you what the market is willing to pay for it now. And the Mach-E has certainly lost a huge amount of its original value. The good news is that the depreciation has already done a lot of its damage. You're not buying a 23,000 pound car and hoping it becomes cheap later. You're buying after the market has already taken the hit. That can be very appealing if you're working with a strict 6,000 pound budget. And there's another reason I like the Mach-E as an opening entry on this list. It demonstrates exactly what we're looking for throughout this video. Not the cheapest SUV, not necessarily the most reliable SUV, and certainly not the most exciting. We're looking for cars where the gap between what people once paid and what you can pay today has become surprisingly large. The Mach-E absolutely fits that description. But would I spend the full 6,000 pounds on just any example? Absolutely not. I'd rather buy a slightly older, well-maintained car with a convincing history than a newer-looking example with a suspiciously low price and a folder full of excuses. Because remember, our golden rule, cheap to buy is not the same thing as cheap to own. And that distinction is going to become even more important as we move further down this list. Because number 4 is another SUV that has taken a serious hit in value, but for a very different reason. And once you see what it is, you may understand why some used car buyers have completely overlooked it. And this is where the list gets a little more interesting, because the next SUV isn't necessarily a car people avoid because it's terrible. In fact, quite the opposite. It's a car that makes a lot of sense on paper, and yet the market has been surprisingly harsh on its value. Number 4, Renault Kadjar. The Renault Kadjar is a perfect example of how quickly the used car market can change its mind. When Renault launched the Kadjar in the UK in 2015, it wasn't positioned as some bargain alternative to the established SUV crowd. The starting price was £17,995, with higher specification versions climbing well beyond £20,000. Renault was clearly aiming the Kadjar at buyers who wanted a proper family crossover, with plenty of equipment, comfort, and a more upmarket feel than the price might initially suggest. Fast forward to today, and the picture is very different. Current UK price guides put many 2015 Kadjars at roughly £4,800 to £5,700, while some 2016 examples can be found around the £5,000 to £6,000 mark privately. And if you search the market aggressively, there are even lower-priced examples. AutoTrader currently shows 2016 Kadjars advertised from around £3,000, although these cheaper cars tend to come with much higher mileage, so you absolutely cannot look at the headline price without looking at the individual car. That is precisely why the Kadjar earns its place here. It isn't necessarily a 70% depreciation story for every version, but depending on the original specification and the current asking price, some examples have come remarkably close to that territory. And when you're talking about a vehicle that started at nearly £18,000, getting into one for around £5,000 is quite a change. Now, here's the clever bit. The Kadjar is not some tiny crossover pretending to be an SUV. It's a proper family-sized machine. It shares its underlying platform with the Nissan Qashqai, but Renault gave the Kadjar its own styling, cabin, and driving character. And that gives you a vehicle that's actually quite easy to live with. The first thing you'll notice is the space. There's a good amount of room inside, the boot is useful, and the cabin has that slightly elevated driving position that's so many SUV buyers are looking for. You're not climbing into something enormous. You're simply getting a bit more height and practicality than you'd normally get from a conventional family hatchback. And for everyday driving, that's a pretty sensible combination. The Kadjar was also sold with a range of engines, including the 1.2-liter TCE petrol and the 1.5-liter DCI diesel in the earlier cars. On paper, both can make sense. But at this age, I'd be far more interested in the history of the individual engine than in simply picking a particular badge from a list. That's especially important with a cheap used SUV. A 100,000-mile car with a meticulous service history can sometimes be a better proposition than a 70,000-mile car that's spent years being neglected. And with a Kadjar, that's not a theoretical concern. Look at the current used market, and you'll find everything from relatively tidy cars around the 6,000-pound mark to very high-mileage examples costing only a few £1,000s. One current AutoTrader example is a 2016 1.5 DCI with more than 130,000 miles advertised at $2,999. Another 2016 example with around 104,000 miles is listed at $4,995, and a 2016 1.6 DCI manual is advertised at $5,995. That's a huge spread, and it tells you something important. The cheapest Kadjar isn't necessarily the bargain. In fact, I'd be suspicious of the cheapest cars on the market until proven otherwise, because you're potentially dealing with high mileage, previous damage, neglected servicing, cosmetic wear, clutch wear, suspension components, and all the other little jobs that accumulate on a vehicle that's spent a decade being driven around Britain. And this is where the Kadjar becomes particularly interesting for our audience. If you're looking for a comfortable everyday SUV, you don't necessarily need the most powerful engine. What matters more is whether the car feels solid, whether the seats are comfortable, whether visibility is good, whether the controls are easy to use, and whether you can get in and out without turning it into a gymnastics exercise. The Kadjar does reasonably well on those fronts. It's also not excessively large. That makes it easier to position in a supermarket car park or a narrow British street than some of the much bigger SUVs that people associate with the word SUV. And if you find a well-equipped example, you can get quite a lot of equipment for your money. Navigation, parking sensors, cruise control, and other convenience features were available depending on trim. That means you can end up with a car that feels considerably more expensive than the 5,000 pounds or 6,000 pounds you actually paid. But now we need to talk about the elephant in the room. The reason these cars are cheap is partly because they're old. And once you're shopping around the 5,000 pound mark, you need to stop thinking like a new car buyer. You're no longer buying a warranty. You're buying the previous owner's maintenance decisions. That's a completely different proposition. So I'd want to see evidence of regular servicing. I'd check the MOT history carefully. I'd look for repeated advisories rather than simply checking whether the latest MOT says pass. I'd inspect the tires. I'd listen for suspension knocks. I'd make sure the clutch doesn't feel tired. I'd test every electronic feature. And on a diesel, I'd want to know how the car has been used. If it's spent most of its life doing short urban journeys, that's very different from a diesel that's regularly covered long motorway distances. The latter type of usage can be much more appropriate for a modern diesel. And then there's the automatic option. The Kadjar was available with Renault's EDC dual clutch automatic, and Renault described the transmission as shifting very quickly, with the automatic costing more than the equivalent manual when new. An automatic can be extremely appealing if you spend a lot of time in traffic, but on an older 5,000 pounds car, I'd never buy an automatic purely because it's convenient. I'd test it thoroughly. Cold, warm, slow maneuvers, reverse, pulling away, hill starts, stop and go traffic. You want smooth, predictable operation, because when you're buying a heavily depreciated SUV, the gearbox is not the sort of component you want to discover needs attention after you've handed over the money. And that's really the theme of the Kadjar. The depreciation makes it interesting. The condition makes it either a bargain or a mistake. There's also an interesting psychological factor here. The Nissan Qashqai became such a familiar name in Britain that it almost became the default choice in this class. The Kadjar never achieved quite the same level of recognition, and that can work against a car's resale value. But for the second-hand buyer, that can sometimes work in your favor. You're not necessarily paying for the same level of badge popularity. You're paying for the actual vehicle sitting in front of you. And that's exactly the kind of thinking you need when you've got 6,000 pounds to spend. Don't ask, what was the most popular SUV? Ask, which car gives me the most usable vehicle for my money without leaving me with a repair bill I can't afford? Because at this end of the market, those are two very different questions. And if the Kadjar has already surprised you with how far its price has fallen, wait until you see what comes next. Because number 3 is where depreciation starts getting genuinely interesting. And this next SUV has one particular feature that could make it extremely tempting if you're trying to get as much equipment as possible for your money. But there's also a reason why the market doesn't value it nearly as highly as you might expect. Now we get to number 3, and this is where the list takes a slightly different turn, because the next SUV isn't just cheap compared with what it originally cost. It is one of those cars where the specification you can get for the money makes you stop and wonder why the market has become so hard on it. And there's a very good reason why buyers have been overlooking it. Number 3, Renault Captur. The Renault Captur is smaller than the Kadjar, so don't confuse the two. The Captur is a compact crossover, designed to give you the raised driving position and SUV-inspired styling without taking up a huge amount of space on the road. And that small size is actually one of its biggest strengths. If you've ever tried maneuvering a large SUV into a tight supermarket car park, or squeezing into one of those ridiculous British parking spaces where you have about 6 inches on either side, you'll understand the appeal immediately. The Captur is much easier to place. It's short, relatively narrow, and has that slightly elevated seating position that makes it feel more substantial than a conventional hatchback. But here's why it makes our list. A 2016 Renault Captur currently has a typical buyer's price of roughly £5,995 to £7,498, with private sale examples generally sitting around the mid £5,000 range. Some individual examples can therefore fall below our £6,000 target, and that means we're now entering the territory where you can realistically walk into the used market with around £6,000 and come away with a compact SUV that once cost considerably more. The interesting thing about the Captur is that it doesn't feel like a stripped-out budget car. Depending on the trim, you could get navigation, cruise control, parking assistance, and plenty of other equipment that would have made the car feel fairly sophisticated when it was new. And that's one of the reasons depreciation can be so useful to a used car buyer. The first owner paid for all that equipment. You don't have to. You'd simply inherit it. But there is another reason the Captur deserves a place here. It's incredibly easy to understand why somebody might want one. You sit relatively high. The doors open wide. The cabin is reasonably airy. The car isn't enormous. And because it's compact, visibility and maneuverability around town are generally much less stressful than they can be in a much larger SUV. For somebody who does a mixture of local journeys, shopping trips, and the occasional longer drive, that can be a very attractive combination. But now comes the part where we need to slow down, because there are several different engines and transmissions to consider. And at this age, the difference between a sensible purchase and a troublesome one can come down to the exact specifications sitting in front of you. Take the little 0.9-liter TC petrol. On paper, it sounds almost comically small for something wearing SUV styling. But remember, this is a compact crossover rather than a 2-ton family 4K4. The advantage is that you get a relatively small petrol engine in a car that doesn't need to haul enormous amounts of weight. And for somebody mainly driving around town, a petrol Captur can make considerably more sense than buying an old diesel simply because diesel sounds more economical. That's an important point. Don't automatically assume that the diesel is the clever choice because you're buying an SUV. If your typical journey is 10 minutes to the shops, 10 minutes home, with the occasional longer trip, an older diesel may not be the ideal match for your driving pattern. On the other hand, if you're regularly covering motorway miles, a diesel can make much more sense. This is why I wouldn't tell you that there's one universally best Captur. There isn't. There's only the best Captur for the way you're actually going to use it. And that's a much more useful way of looking at a used car. Now, the market itself gives us an interesting warning. You can find Capturs around the 6,000 pound mark, but you can also find examples with very high mileage considerably cheaper. One recent UK buyer, for example, reported finding a 2016 0.9 TCE with 101,000 miles for 3,995 pounds and was weighing up whether the low price justified the mileage. That is exactly the kind of decision you'll encounter at this end of the market. A 4,000 pounds Captur may look spectacular next to a 6,000 pound one, but if the 4,000 pounds car needs a clutch, tires, suspension work, and a major service, you've very quickly closed the gap and possibly gone beyond it. So don't fall in love with the number on the windscreen. Fall in love with the condition of the car. Now, there is another area where I'd be particularly careful. The Captur was available with automatic transmissions, and an automatic can be wonderful if you spend a lot of time in traffic. But when you're buying an older automatic for around 5,000 pounds or 6,000 pounds, you need to test it properly. Don't just drive around the block. Start the car from cold if possible. Select reverse. Move away gently. Try a hill. Try slow maneuvering. Try accelerating firmly. Pay attention to hesitation, juddering, harsh engagement, or anything that simply doesn't feel right, because a gearbox problem can turn a seemingly brilliant bargain into a very expensive car very quickly. And that's particularly important with a vehicle whose entire appeal is based on affordability. You don't want to save 1,000 pounds on the purchase price and then spend 2,000 pounds trying to put the car right. The same principle applies to the engine. Listen carefully from cold. Watch for warning lights. Check the oil level. Look underneath the car. Look around the engine bay for obvious leaks. And don't be embarrassed to ask the seller to let you see the car before it's been warmed up. If everything is already hot when you arrive, ask yourself why. It doesn't necessarily mean anything sinister, of course, but when you're spending most of your savings on a used car, you are perfectly entitled to inspect it properly. And this is where the Captur can actually make a lot of sense. If you find a well-maintained example, you're getting something that's relatively easy to drive, relatively easy to park, and sufficiently spacious for everyday life without having to deal with the bulk of a larger SUV. It's also worth remembering that the Captur was designed with practicality in mind. The rear bench can slide, allowing you to balance rear passenger room against boot space. That sort of flexibility can be more useful in everyday life than a giant boot figure printed in a brochure. You might not notice it on a test drive, but when you're carrying shopping, luggage, or passengers, little practical touches suddenly become important. And that's one of the things I like about this car as a used proposition. It doesn't try too hard. It's not pretending to be a luxury SUV. It's not pretending to be a serious off-roader. It's a small, comfortable crossover designed to make everyday driving a little easier. But the depreciation tells us something else. The Captur has never carried quite the same prestige as some of the bigger name SUVs, and that's actually part of what creates the opportunity. You're not paying a premium simply because everybody wants one. You're looking at a car that has already taken a significant depreciation hit and asking whether the remaining vehicle is good enough for your needs. That is exactly the mindset you want when shopping with 6,000 pounds. But there's a catch, and it's a big one. At this price point, you need to be realistic about age and mileage. A 5,500 pounds Captur isn't a nearly new SUV anymore. It's a used car that's getting on in years. So if you want something with low mileage, immaculate paintwork, perfect tires, and a complete dealer history, you may need to increase your budget. If, however, you're prepared to search patiently for the right example, the Captur can give you something that many buyers overlook, SUV practicality without SUV size, and that's valuable, especially when you're buying for everyday use rather than trying to impress the neighbors. But we're not finished yet. because we've now seen three very different types of depreciation bargain. The Mach-E gives you a surprisingly large discount from its original price. The Kadjar gives you a more substantial family SUV for relatively little money. And the Captur gives you a compact crossover that's easy to live with. But the next two are where things get really interesting, because number two is going to show us just how much brand reputation can influence what a used SUV is worth. And number one? Well, number one is the car I'd be most interested in if I had exactly 6,000 pounds and wanted to avoid buying something simply because it looked cheap. And that's where the difference between a genuine bargain and a financial headache becomes very, very important. And now we're getting to the two cars that, in my view, really show why depreciation can completely change the way you should look at a used SUV. Because when a car loses value, people often assume the market has discovered something terrible about it. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes the explanation is much simpler. The badge isn't fashionable. The car wasn't popular when new. The manufacturer had a smaller dealer network, or buyers simply decided they wanted something else. And that's exactly what makes number two so interesting. Number two, SsangYong Korando. You may have heard of SsangYong, or perhaps you haven't. And that's actually part of the story. The Korando has always been something of an outsider in the UK SUV market. It was competing against cars like the Nissan Qashqai, Kia Sportage, and Hyundai Tucson, but without anything like the same level of recognition. And that lack of brand recognition has had a very interesting effect on used prices. Look at the current market, and you can find 2016 Korandos for remarkably little money. There are examples listed around £3,500, £3,995, and £4,990, while even an automatic 2.2-liter diesel with four-wheel drive can appear around the £6,795 mark. And that's where things get interesting, because the Korando isn't some tiny crossover. It's a proper mid-sized SUV. You get a reasonably spacious cabin, a useful boot, and, depending on specification, plenty of equipment. In fact, one of the strongest arguments for the Korando has always been value for money. It was designed to give buyers a lot of SUV for their money. And that becomes even more obvious when you're buying one second-hand. Imagine you're standing in a used car dealer's forecourt with 5,000 pounds in your pocket. On one side, you've got a very familiar badge. On the other, you've got a Korando that may have leather seats, a reversing camera, parking sensors, four-wheel drive, and a much more substantial feel than you might expect for the Mon. Why, which one looks more expensive? That's where the Korando can surprise you. But before you rush out and buy one, there's something you need to understand. The reason it's cheap isn't entirely because it's a secret bargain. Part of the reason is that the market never valued the badge particularly highly in the first place, and that matters. Because when you're buying an obscure used car, you need to think about what happens after you buy it. Parts availability, specialist knowledge, resale value, insurance, and the ability to find somebody who actually knows what they're doing when something goes wrong. The Korando isn't necessarily impossible to maintain, but it isn't a Qashqai. That's an important distinction. If something goes wrong with a Qashqai, you've got a huge number of independent garages and parts suppliers familiar with the car. With a less common SsangYong, you may need to do a little more homework. That doesn't automatically make it a bad purchase. In fact, if you're comfortable doing that homework, it can be precisely why the car is so cheap. The market has already punished it for being unfamiliar, and you're potentially benefiting from that punishment. Now, the 2016 Korando gives us another interesting consideration. The 2.2-liter diesel became a particularly important engine for the model, and you could find versions with four-wheel drive and automatic transmission. And that sounds impressive when you're looking at a 5,000-pound budget, a mid-sized SUV. Diesel, automatic, four-wheel drive, that's a combination that can sound far more expensive than the price suggests. But again, this is where you need to keep your head. A four-wheel drive system is another mechanical system that can require maintenance. An automatic gearbox is another thing you need to test. A diesel has its own emissions equipment, and a larger SUV can consume more fuel and tires than a smaller crossover. So don't buy the Korando because the specific Asian sheet looks enormous. Buy it because the individual car makes sense. And there are some genuinely interesting examples out there. Current listings include a 2016 2.2 diesel ELX with around 78,000 miles for £4,990, while another example with around 88,000 miles is advertised at just under £4,000. That's the kind of pricing that makes you stop and think. But it also tells you something else. Mileage matters enormously. A 3,500 pounds Korando with 120,000 miles isn't equivalent to a 5,500 pound car with 60,000 miles. You need to understand what you're buying. And if you find a diesel Korando that has spent most of its life doing short trips around town, I'd be especially cautious. Diesel technology is happiest when the vehicle gets properly warmed up and used for longer journeys. If your driving consists almost entirely of short hop, a petrol vehicle may make more sense. This is one of those occasions where buying the most economical engine can actually be the wrong decision, because fuel economy is only one part of ownership cost. A car that uses slightly more fuel but suits your driving pattern can be a much better proposition than a diesel that develops an expensive expensive emissions-related problem because it has been used incorrectly. And then there's the driving experience. The Corando isn't the sort of SUV you're buying because you want razor-sharp handling. It's more about practicality. You sit high. There's plenty of room. The suspension is aimed more at comfort than outright sportiness, and that makes sense. If you're doing long motorway journeys, carrying passengers, or simply want something that feels substantial without paying modern SUV money, the Corando has a lot going for it. It also has that increasingly rare quality of feeling like you're getting a lot of metal for your money. And that's becoming harder to find. But there's one thing I'd absolutely check before buying: the underside. Get the car inspected. Look for corrosion. Check the suspension. Check the brakes. Look at the tires. Listen for drivetrain noises. And if you're considering a four-wheel drive version, make sure the system behaves as it should. Don't assume that because the seller says 4x4 works perfectly, that it actually does. Test it. And if you're buying from a private seller, get the paperwork right. Check the V5C. Check the VIN. Check the MOT history. Run a proper history check. Make sure there isn't outstanding finance or a history you weren't told about. And if the seller becomes uncomfortable with you carrying out basic checks, that's your cue to walk away. Because when you're buying a 5,000-pound car, you can't afford to be sentimental. Now, there is another reason the Corando is fascinating. Its depreciation is not necessarily a story of the car becoming dramatically worse. It's partly a story of buyers never really falling in love with the badge. And that's something you can exploit. The same thing happens with watches, houses, electronics, and almost anything else people buy. Perception affects price. And in the used car market, perception can create some spectacular bargains. The Corando may never have had the glamour of a premium SUV. It may never have been the first car somebody names when you ask them to recommend a family crossover. But if your priority is getting a lot of practical SUV for around 5,000 pounds, that lack of popularity can suddenly look rather attractive. And yet, I still wouldn't call it the safest choice on this list, because number one has something the Corando doesn't: much stronger reputation in the UK, a huge supply of used examples, a familiar badge, and crucially, a depreciation curve that can make a normally expensive SUV look surprisingly affordable. Number one, Nissan Qashqai. Yes, the Nissan Qashqai. And before you say, hang on, isn't that one of Britain's most popular SUVs? Exactly. That's what makes number one so interesting. The Qashqai became one of the defining cars of Britain's SUV boom. It helped create the modern crossover market, and for years it was one of the obvious choices for people who wanted something practical, slightly higher off the ground, and easy to live with. But here's the thing: popularity, when new, doesn't mean every used example remains expensive forever. And once you start looking at older Qashqais, the prices can become surprisingly low. We're talking about cars that gave buyers the SUV shape, elevated seating position, and family practicality they wanted, but which have now reached the point where depreciation has done much of the heavy lifting for you. And that is why I would take a very close look at a Qashqai before spending 6,000 pounds elsewhere. But there is a reason I haven't finished this one yet, because the Qashqai isn't automatically the winner. The engine you choose matters. The transmission matters. The service history matters. And the difference between a genuinely good Qashqai and a neglected one can be enormous. And in part 5, we're going to put all 5 cars side by side, because once you take the emotion out of the purchase and look at depreciation, reliability, comfort, running costs, practicality, and risk, the answer isn't necessarily the car you expect. So we've now reached the end of the list. And if you've been following along, you've probably noticed something quite important. These 5 SUVs aren't cheap for exactly the same reason. The Vauxhall Mokka-X suffered heavy depreciation because small crossovers became incredibly competitive. The Renault Kadjar lost plenty of value while sitting in the shadow of more famous rivals. The Renault Captur gives you a smaller, easier to live with package for relatively little money. The SsangYong Corando is the wild card. A lot of SUV for very little money, partly because the badge never achieved the recognition of its mainstream rivals. And then there's the Nissan Qashqai, the obvious choice, or at least it looks like the obvious choice. But let's put all 5 into perspective before you start searching the classified. So, which one actually makes the most sense? Let's start with the Vauxhall Mokka-X. If your priority is getting into a compact SUV for as little money as possible, it's hard to ignore. You can find examples dramatically below their original new car pricing, and the driving position, compact dimensions, and equipment make it quite appealing for everyday use. But I'd be very selective. The cheapest Mokka-X on the internet isn't necessarily the one I'd buy. I'd rather pay a little more for a car with a strong service history, a clean MOT record, and sensible mileage than save 1,000 pounds and inherit somebody else's problems. So for the Mokka-X, my advice is simple: buy the car, not the discount. Next, the Renault Kadjar. This is probably the one I'd look at if I wanted something that feels like a proper family SUV without spending proper family SUV money. It's larger than the Captur, practical, comfortable, and easy enough to live with. And the fact that it never achieved quite the same level of popularity as the Qashqai has helped push used prices down. But again, don't go straight for the cheapest diesel you can find. Look at how the car aged. It's been used. Look at its mileage. Look at its servicing. And if you're considering an automatic, test the gearbox properly. Remember, you're not buying a new Renault. You're buying a car that's already spent years on British roads. That's a completely different proposition. Then we have the Renault Captur. And this is probably the easiest one to recommend to somebody who spends most of their time around town. It's compact. It's relatively easy to park. You've got the raised driving position. There's useful interior flexibility, and you don't have to deal with the size of a larger SUV. The downside is that it simply isn't as spacious or substantial as the Kadjar or Corando. So if you've regularly got adults sitting in the back or you carry a lot of luggage, I'd think carefully before choosing the smaller Captur. But if your driving is mostly local and you value maneuverability, it makes a lot of sense. Then comes the SsangYong Corando, and this is the one I would call the wild card, because if somebody said, give me the most SUV for around 5,000 pounds, I'd have to put the Corando on the short list. The amount of car you can get for the money is genuinely interesting, but you're accepting more risk. The badge is less common. The used market is smaller, and you need to be more comfortable doing your homework before buying. I particularly want to know where I'd take the car for servicing and repairs before handing over the money, because a bargain isn't much of a bargain if you don't have a sensible way of maintaining it. And finally, the Nissan Qashqai. This is where things get interesting, because the Qashqai is probably the easiest recommendation for the average buyer. It's familiar. There are loads of them around. Independent garages know them. Parts availability is generally much easier than with something obscure, and its popularity means you have plenty of examples to choose from. But here's the problem. At the time of writing, a typical 2016 Qashqai is actually above our 6,000 pound target. Honest John's current buyer's guide puts most 2016 examples around 7,499 pounds to 9,495 pounds, although private sale values can be lower and individual high mileage cars can fall considerably below that range. So I'm going to make an important correction to the original idea behind this video. If your budget is strictly 6,000 pounds, don't force yourself into a Qashqai simply because it's number one on the list. You may find one, but you'll probably be looking at an older, higher mileage, or less desirable specification. And that means the supposedly safe choice may actually expose you to more risk. The Qashqai's age-related issues also deserve attention. MOT data for 2016 cars shows suspension, steering, and axle-related defects appearing more frequently than the average car of the same year. So checking the underside and listening for suspension knocks is particularly worthwhile. And there's another reason to be careful. Some owners report transmission concerns with certain versions, particularly older CVT-equipped cars. That doesn't mean every automatic Qashqai is bad, but it does mean you shouldn't buy one without thoroughly testing the gearbox and checking its history. So if I had exactly 6,000 pounds, what would I personally do? I wouldn't walk into a dealership and say, I need a Qashqai. I'd say, I have 6,000 pounds. Show me the best maintained SUV you have. And that's a completely different approach. My choice with 6,000, if I had to choose one of these five with my own money, I'd probably start with the Renault Kadjar. Not because it's the most exciting, not because it's the most reliable SUV ever made, and certainly not because every Kadjar is a bargain. I choose it because it offers a very useful balance. You get proper SUV practicality without going to the size and running costs of something much larger. You get a comfortable driving position. You get decent interior space. And most important, there are enough examples around that you can afford to be selective. And that's incredibly important at this price point. If the first Kadjar you look at has poor history, walk away. If the second has worn tires, a questionable MOT history, and a tired clutch, walk away. If the third has been properly serviced, drives beautifully, and has a convincing history, that's the one you investigate. You don't need to buy the first car you see. In fact, when you're spending 6,000 pounds, you shouldn't. And that brings us to perhaps the most important part of the entire video. The 6,000 pound rule. Before buying any heavily depreciated SUV, keep some money back. Don't spend your entire budget on the car. If you've got 6,000 pounds available, I'd much rather see you buy a 5,000 pound car and keep 1,000 pounds available for unexpected maintenance than spend 6,000 pounds and have nothing left. Because tires wear out, batteries fail, brakes need replacing, suspension components age, clutches eventually wear. And sometimes something completely unexpected decides to ruin your weekend. That's normal used car ownership. The mistake is pretending it won't happen. And there are a few things I'd check every single time. First, the MOT history. Don't just look at the latest result. Look backwards. If the same suspension component has appeared as an advisory 3 years running, that's useful information. If the mileage suddenly jumps backwards, walk away. If the car has accumulated a long list of advisories and failures, don't assume the seller has magically fixed everything. Second, check the service history. A stamped book is nice. Actual invoices are better. You want evidence of what was done and when. Third, check the V5C and vehicle identification number. Then run a proper vehicle history check before committing. Fourth, inspect the car in daylight. Don't buy a car at night because the seller says it's too difficult to meet during the day. You want to see the paint. You want to see the tires. You want to see underneath. You want to see whether the panels line up. And if you're buying from a dealer, don't be afraid to take the car for a proper test drive. Try the brakes, try reversing, try parking, try accelerating, try the controls, try the air conditioning, try the infotainment, try everything. Because once you've paid for the car, the test drive is over. And here's the biggest lesson. The fact that an SUV has lost 70% or even more of its original value doesn't automatically make it a bargain. It simply means the first owner took the biggest depreciation hit. That's useful, very useful. But only if the car that's left is actually worth owning. And that's why I'd rather buy a 5,500-pound SUV with a complete history and evidence of proper maintenance than a 3,500 pounds example that looks like a bargain until the warning lights start appearing. The best bargains aren't necessarily the cars with the lowest prices. They're the cars where the price is low, but the quality of the individual example is still high. That's the sweet spot. And if you're patient enough to find it, depreciation can genuinely work in your favor. So, out of these 5, which one would you choose? Would you take the compact Mach-X, go for the larger Kadjar, choose the city-friendly Captur, take a gamble on the underrated Corando, or stretch the budget for a Qashqai because you want the familiar name? Let me know in the comments. And if you're currently shopping for a used SUV, don't just look at the badge. Look at the history, look at the condition, and look at what you're actually getting for your money, because the cheapest SUV isn't always the bargain, and the car that lost the most money isn't necessarily the one you should buy. Sometimes the biggest opportunity is simply finding the car that everybody else stopped looking at. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe for more UK used car buying guides, depreciation bargains, and cars that could be worth a second look before you spend your hard-earned money. And I'll see you in the next one.